On December 7, 1900, Captain James Harvey steered the steamer ship Hesperus through the treacherous waters surrounding the Flannan Isles, a remote and desolate archipelago off the coast of northwestern Scotland. The weather was worsening, and the sea was becoming increasingly volatile. As the vessel neared the largest of these islands, Captain Harvey steered his eyes toward the peak of the cliffs where the newly constructed lighthouse stood. The towering structure was designed to guide ships safely through these exact lethal conditions. However, on that pitch-black night, Captain Harvey noticed a profound abnormality. The massive lantern at the top of the tower was completely dark. The Hesperus was a scheduled supply ship, and its crew knew with technical certainty that the light was supposed to be operational every single second between dusk and dawn. Captain Harvey could not immediately launch a boat to investigate, but he logged the anomaly. It was a failure in the maritime signaling system that had never occurred since the light was first lit. On December 26, 1900, nearly 3 weeks after the initial observation of the blackout, the weather finally cleared enough for the Hesperus to make landfall on Eilean Mòr. The mission was straightforward: relieve one of the lighthouse keepers and deliver essential supplies. As the ship dropped anchor near the east landing, the crew noticed that the standard protocol for an arriving supply vessel was completely ignored. No flag was raised on the signal staff. No supply boxes were prepared on the landing stage. More importantly, none of the lighthouse keepers were waiting down by the rocks to assist with the lines. Captain Harvey sounded the ship's steam whistle and fired a warning flare into the grey sky. But the island remained completely silent. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper who was scheduled to take his shift on the island, boarded a small rowboat and made the difficult journey to the rocky shore alone. He ascended the steep, winding stone steps cut into the cliffside, heading directly toward the lighthouse complex. When Moore reached the outer compound, he found the entrance gate closed. He pushed it open and walked to the main entrance door of the keeper's quarters. The heavy door was locked from the inside. Using his spare key, Moore unlocked the door and stepped into the kitchen. Inside, the environment was frozen in an eerie state of abrupt abandonment. The room was cold, the fire in the hearth had died out days ago, and a half-eaten meal sat untouched on the table. A small kitchen clock hung on the wall, its internal gears completely stopped. As Moore moved further into the living quarters, he checked the hooks where the men kept their heavy waterproof gear. He noticed that one set of oilskins belonging to the third keeper, Donald MacArthur, was still hanging on its hook. This meant MacArthur had gone out into the freezing winter elements without his essential protective clothing. Moore searched the bedrooms, the storage areas, and then climbed the winding iron staircase to the very top of the lighthouse tower. The grand lantern was clean, the oil reservoirs were full, and the machinery was in perfect working order. Everything was technically ready to operate, but the three keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, had completely vanished without leaving a single trace of struggle or DNA behind. What happened inside this isolated maritime structure? How did three experienced men disappear from a locked compound surrounded by vertical cliffs? To understand the sequence of events that led to this systemic failure, we must rewind the timeline to December 5, 1900. This was the date when the official shifts rotated, and the three-man crew began their fatal term on Eilean Mòr. The crew was comprised of highly competent personnel. James Ducat was the principal keeper, a 44-year-old veteran with years of flawless service. Thomas Marshall was the second assistant keeper, an experienced man accustomed to the isolation of offshore stations. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper, a rugged individual filling in for an ailing colleague. Their job required strict adherence to a rigid daily protocol, maintaining the light, tracking weather data every 3 hours in the official logbook, and keeping the structural integrity of the station intact. For the first week of their shift, the station functioned with clockwork efficiency. The keepers followed their technical routines without issue. They cooked their meals, cleaned the enormous glass lenses of the lantern, and meticulously filled out the columns of the official logbook. Because the island had no telegraph wire or radio communication equipment, their only link to the mainland was visual observation from passing ships or the distant shore of the Isle of Lewis. If an emergency occurred, they were instructed to hoist a specific flag or fire a rocket signal. The timeline becomes highly detailed on December 12, 1900, when Thomas Marshall began making irregular entries in the official station logbook. According to these written logs, a severe storm began battering the island on the evening of December 12. Marshall noted that the winds were blowing with a velocity and ferocity unlike anything he had ever witnessed in his entire career as a keeper. This entry itself presented a significant logical discrepancy, as Marshall was a seasoned mariner who had survived numerous Atlantic gales. The entry on December 13 deepened the mystery. Marshall wrote that the storm continued to escalate in intensity, causing the heavy stone lighthouse tower to vibrate under the force of the wind. More disturbingly, he noted that principal keeper James Duckett was uncharacteristically quiet, and that Donald MacArthur, a man known as a tough, hardened brawler, was sitting in the corner of the kitchen crying. This behavioral data was completely irrational. These men were chosen for their psychological resilience against extreme isolation and severe weather. The idea that a standard winter storm would reduce them to tears was a massive psychological anomaly. The final entry in the logbook was written on the morning of December 15, 1900. The text was brief and stated simply, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." After this entry, the logbook went completely blank. No further technical data, weather observations, or daily notes were ever recorded. The timeline of their recorded activity stopped permanently on that morning. Later that same night, December 15, a passing steamship named the Archtor navigated the waters near the Flannan Isles. The crew of the Archtor noted in their own logs that the Flannan light was completely dark, and they actually reported this system failure to the maritime authorities when they docked at the port of Leith. However, due to administrative delays and a lack of urgency within the Regional Shipping Bureau, the information was not acted upon, and no rescue boats were deployed. The 3 men remained missing on their silent island for another 11 days before the Hesperus finally arrived. When Joseph Moore discovered the empty station on December 26, he quickly ran down to the landing stage to notify Captain Harvey. The captain immediately sent a search party of several sailors ashore to assist Moore in conducting a thorough investigation of the entire island. They expanded their search grid from the lighthouse tower down to the 2 natural landing sites on the eastern and western cliffs of Eilean Mòr. When the investigators reached the east landing, everything appeared structurally intact. The ropes, pulleys, and supply tracks were secured according to standard operating procedures. However, when the search party crossed over to the west landing, the side of the island that directly faced the raw, open Atlantic Ocean, they discovered immense physical destruction that defied the official weather data. The concrete stairs leading down to the water were completely shattered. A heavy iron railing running along the walkway was bent out of shape, twisted like a thin wire by an unimaginable physical force. A massive storage crate containing anchoring ropes and tools, which was securely bolted into a concrete platform over 110 feet above sea level, had been completely torn from its foundations and smashed into splinters. Scattered fragments of the wooden crate and frayed pieces of heavy rope were found strewn across the rocks high above the water line. The physical data indicated that a force of immense kinetic energy had struck the western cliffs of the island. Following the initial recovery efforts, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, Robert Muirhead, arrived on the island to conduct an official forensic investigation. Muirhead was a deeply analytical man who knew all three keepers personally, having hired and trained them. He carefully cross-referenced the physical evidence at the West Landing with the contents of the kitchen, the missing clothes, and the timeline in the logbook. Muirhead launched a deep investigation into the weather records kept by independent coastal stations and passing ships during the period between December 12 and December 15. The results of this data search uncovered a massive contradiction that blew the case wide open. According to official meteorological records from the Maine Weather Bureau on the mainland, there were no storms in the vicinity of the Flannan Isles on December 12, 13, or 14. The weather across that entire region of the Atlantic was logged as calm and clear. The massive, terrifying gale that Thomas Marshall had described in the logbook, the storm that allegedly drove the hardened keepers to tears, did not exist in the physical world. A severe storm did not actually strike the archipelago until the afternoon of December 16, a full day after the final logbook entry was written and the light had already gone dark. This logic error left investigators with a profound paradox. Why would an experienced keeper fabricate multiple days of terrifying weather data in an official government document? Muirhead compiled his final report, formulating a hypothesis that remains the official explanation of the British government. He posited that on the afternoon of December 15, a freak meteorological event occurred. He theorized that while the general weather was calm, a series of sudden, massive rogue waves generated by a distant Atlantic disturbance struck the western cliffs of Eilean Mòr without warning. According to Muirhead's theory, Thomas Marshall and James Ducat walked down to the West Landing to secure the loose equipment and rope crates. While they were working near the edge, an enormous wall of water surged up the 110-foot cliff, sweeping both men into the sea. Donald MacArthur, observing the disaster from the lighthouse window, panically ran out to assist his comrades, failing to grab his heavy oilskin coat in his haste. As he reached the cliff edge, a second rogue wave caught him, dragging the third and final keeper into the freezing depths of the ocean. While Muirhead's rogue wave hypothesis provided a neat mechanical explanation for the physical destruction at the West Landing, it left massive gaps in logic that independent analysts have pointed out for over a century. If the men were swept away on December 15, it still failed to explain the fabricated log entries from December 12 to December 14 describing a non-existent storm. Furthermore, maritime protocol strictly forbade all three keepers from ever leaving the lighthouse station empty simultaneously. One man was legally required to stay inside the tower at all times to manage the equipment. Ducat and Marshall were highly disciplined professionals who would never violate this fundamental safety mandate simply to secure an exterior rope crate. Alternative theories have emerged to explain the psychological anomaly inside the cabin. Some analysts suggest that the island's unique rock formations and deep-sea caves acted as a natural acoustic amplifier. When strong, low-velocity winds passed through these subterranean chambers, they could have generated intense, silent waves of infrasound. As medical science has documented, prolonged exposure to infrasound can trigger severe psychological breakdown, deep hallucinations, intense paranoia, and extreme vertigo. If the island was engulfed by an infrasound pocket, the keepers may have experienced a collective cognitive failure, believing a catastrophic phantom storm was destroying the tower, driving them to madness, and causing them to flee their locked quarters to leap off the cliffs into the sea. To this day, the bodies of Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur have never been recovered by any coastal patrol or naval vessel. The ocean around Eilean Mòr kept its secrets completely locked away. The Northern Lighthouse Board eventually automated the Flannan Isles Light, removing the need for human personnel entirely. The cold stone tower still stands on the high cliffs of the island, a mechanical sentinel operating in total isolation, reminding mariners of the time the system failed completely, and 3 men vanished into a storm that history says never happened.